Okay, here we go. Last bit of chapter 12. All right. Okay, so African religions, Christians' conversions. So African-born slaves continue to worship their traditional gods. So those who were familiar with African culture and whatnot would bring their religion and their culture with them. Sometimes it had to be hidden. You have ministers such as Presbyterian Charles C. Jones that believed that whites should convert the slaves. Some slaves became Christians in the Chesapeake, and they were sold to the Deep South. And so that would bring Christianity down to the South. They adapted Protestantism to their needs. Slaves disliked and avoided passages in the Bible that told them to obey authority without question. Some believed they would be liberated as the Jews had been in the Old Testament. They adapted music to their African roots and spiritual needs, and worship becomes distinctive and joyous. And you will get a lot of, this is where the traditional Black Baptist church comes from, and the old hymnals and things that they would sing. So a lot of that would come from the African roots. All right, by 1820, the percentage of slaves born in Africa was decreasing. It's about 20% in South Carolina. You have regional differences that are very evident. The Mississippi Valley population had a large number of slaves who descended from the Congo region of Western Central Africa. They shunned marriages between cousins, which African incest was a taboo. Not so much in the southern elite planters. You would often marry a cousin to a cousin to keep the money in the family. These marriages were common in the South. Slave marriages were not recognized by law, although marriages did often take place in front of ministers. Because it's not recognized by law, it allows the slave owner to divide them up and sell them off separately if need be, or just because they want to. Slaves who came from Africa often gave their children African names. Many American-born slaves chose English names. All right. So families and communities provided order among slaves. Collective unity aided slaves in achieving additional rights. So basically task work in South Carolina, opportunity to make some additional money. Slaveholders do fear rebellion among slaves that organized. It's difficult to maintain order unless a slave owner was comfortable using violence. Really, only hardened or sadistic masters had the stomach for such violence. So, although it is commonly believed that violence is used all the time, it was not used by everybody. It was a problem. Obviously, there were slaves who were beat. There were slaves who were treated horribly. That is not necessarily true in every plantation. So there were ways that they kind of survived or rebelled without getting into too much trouble. They would slow the pace of work by pretending to be sick or breaking tools. They insisted that they be sold in families. They burned their master's home or barn. They poisoned the food, destroyed the crops. Any of these tactics could be met with violence by the masters, including the rape of slaves. Few slaves rebelled violently. You do have Prosser's Rebellion in 1800, Nat Turner in 1831. Neither are successful. Nat Turner's Rebellion, I think they kill 50 white people before they're caught. But they are caught and punished. Basically, they're killed. Escape was difficult for those in the Deep South. Escape from any plantation meant leaving behind family members. So even if it was a brother or a sister or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle, that was a choice you would have to make is if you were going to escape for freedom, because it is hard to escape in multiples, especially with children. All right, about half of the free blacks lived in the North. Discrimination against them do keep them in low-paying jobs and considered socially inferior. So even though they were not enslaved in the North, they were not considered equals. Few northern states gave black men suffrage. They weren't allowed to vote. Only in Massachusetts are they allowed to actually testify against whites in court. So even if there was a crime committed by a white person against a black person, it went to court, the black person could not speak on their own behalf. Black activist Martin Delany remarks, "We are slaves in the midst of freedom." Created strong institutions including businesses, schools, mutual benefit societies, free African societies, and new religious denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That is a mouthful. The free black population in slave states is approximately 225,000 in 1860. Most are going to live in coastal cities and in the upper South. They do face the dangers of being forced into slavery. They did have to bring their papers with them or their badge that said they were free everywhere they went. They were denied jury trials, or they were simply kidnapped and sold into slavery. Very few free blacks owned slaves. You do have David Barlin, who's mixed race in Mississippi. He does own at least 18. So there are cases of black people owning slaves. Free black men were symbols to slaves of potential for freedom. So it was something that they really looked upon as the way to for their future life to go. So, well, that is all of Chapter 12. So that ends our conversation on slavery. We obviously will continue it in class, but I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye.